Hello and welcome to Straight Talk. I'm Yusuf Aram. Since the collapse of the Assad regime, Israel has launched hundreds of airstrikes across Syria, all while expanding its illegal occupation of the Golan Heights. Now it's initiated a new wave of attacks, striking Syria's defense ministry in the heart of Damascus. The air raids also hit southern regions already reeling from days of violence between armed Druze and Bedouin groups. While Israel claims it's acting to defend the Druze, critics say these operations are part of a broader campaign, one that's redrawing lines across Syria. Israel's first strikes were in Sweida, where Syrian forces had been deployed to contain ethnic clashes. Syrian President Alsharaa said his government would protect the Druze and accused Israel of stoking instability. He praised Turkish, Arab, and American mediation efforts aimed at de-escalation. The US, EU, and Arab states have urged Israel to halt its campaign. And Turkish President Erdogan has gone further, warning that Turkey will not allow Syria's fragmentation. To break down what's behind the attack and what it signals for the region, joining me now from Washington, D.C. is İbrahim Al-Asil, a fellow at the Atlantic Council. From Ankara, Ömer Özkızılcık, a foreign policy and security analyst. And also from Washington, D.C., former U.S. diplomat William Lawrence. Gentlemen, thanks for joining me. It seems like Syria can't catch a break. I mean, you were worried about the Russians, worried about the Iranians. Now you have Israel. So, Ibrahim, I mean, we see these two groups, the Druze and the Bedouins. They've been clashing. Can you give us some background? What's that about?
Great to be with you, Yusuf. And the background is really complicated and has very long history because the tension between the Druze and the Arab Bedouins in Syria predates the creation and the establishment of the modern states inside Syria. These two groups that lived side by side. Sometimes they competed, sometimes they cooperated, and they had an alliances among themselves against others. And sometimes they fought. They fought mainly over resources, over land, over water, and also over power and authority. Over the last few months, there has been a vacuum in the security in southern Syria. There have been multiple clashes between the Druze and the Arab Bedouins, and there are no government forces that can actually intervene between them to calm both sides and maintain security in southern Syria. And that's one of the reasons why we are where we are today. And finally, when the latest fighting erupted between both sides, the government forces intervened. Many accused the government forces of intervening on the Bedouin sides, trying to control Sweida because of the mistrust. And that's what probably explains some aspects of what's happening today.
Mm-hmm. So, Ömer, the government forces intervened towards the end, and there was these accusations that they intervened on the Bedouin side. When Ahmed al-Sharaa is looking at this situation going on just to the south of the capital, too, not far away, what's his biggest concern regarding that security situation?
I mean, obviously, the biggest concern is that the Syrian state authority may not be able to be established over all of Syria as Syrian territory. Here, we have to underline that the Syrian government has reached 4 consecutive agreements with the Druze to establish a security order and facilitate the integration of government institutions or the extension towards the governorate of Sweida. And actually, after the Syrian army intervened between the Bedouins and the Druze militias, we have seen that several Syrian army personnel were executed on the field by Druze militias, and this prompted the Syrian government to enter into Sweida city to go after these Druze militias. However, in the end, there was an agreement between the Druze leadership and the Syrian government, the 4th agreement, and the Syrian government accepted to withdraw all of its Syrian army personnel and only to let behind police forces. But then we have seen that the Druze militias loyal to Hikmet Hajeri, who is close to Israel, has ambushed these police forces, and we have seen intensive Israeli airstrike. So what is happening now is that Ahmed al-Sharaa had in the end to withdraw totally all of its government forces from the governorate, and this gives a vacuum of state authority. So the Syrian state is now in a situation in which it cannot assert its control and dominance and state authority over Syrian territory. And this may ultimately weaken the Syrian state and Ahmed Hashi's aspiration to establish a centralized government all over Syria.
So, William, I mean, Israel has been watching this very closely, and Netanyahu hadn't bombed anywhere for a month, so I guess felt like he was missing out. And we're seeing a lot of Israeli strikes across Syria. Now, after the revolution, we saw some Israeli strikes, and they claimed that they wanted to ensure that their national security was protected. So they hit some military targets. But now we're seeing a different explanation coming from Tel Aviv saying, well, we want to support the Druze minority. What is Netanyahu after? Is that all? He just wants to protect the Druze? Or is there something else behind that?
I think it's all of the above, and I agree entirely with what your other two guests said. I believe that Israel wants a buffer zone. It wants a sort of client ethnic group connected to its own Druze, although they have a somewhat different historical trajectory and set of political interests than the Druze inside Israel. There are the domestic Israeli political considerations which play hugely into what it does in Syria, and it wants to weaken the Syrian state, as it has been doing since December. And so, whatever it can do to not necessarily create conflict for conflict's sake, but to assert its interests within Syria at the expense of the Syrian government, it will do so, almost as a demonstration effect. And the only thing that is sure to be able to hold the Israelis back is the Americans. And the Americans are sort of caught between two objectives here. One is to allow Syria, to the extent possible, to assert itself hegemonically in all of the states and areas that it wants to assert itself without toppling or rendering the Shah government so weak that it can't help Syria turn the corner politically and economically. And, I don't know which way the U.S. is going to go, because there are factions advising Trump on sort of both sides of that argument. Barak has said the right things at times, and then other times the U.S. Doesn't do enough to defend not only Syrian sovereignty, but Syrian ability to succeed in extremely fraught circumstances. So it'll probably take more U.S. assertion here to stabilize things.
Ibrahim, there's been a lot of global condemnation. I was actually surprised at the amount of statements coming out, because we didn't see this type of condemnation when it was Iran. Maybe even more condemnation than the Gaza operation as well. So why is especially the West, Europe, and the United States very concerned right now about what Israel is doing in Syria?
Because the number of attacks from the Syrian government or the Syrian side on Israel is zero. There has been no attacks whatsoever, not even by words, from the Syrian government against Israel. And that's why this intervention is not justified by any way. You mentioned with my colleagues about that, there were aerial bombardments early on, and Israel said that we're targeting some threats here and there in Syria. But that's now is over 800 or 900 attacks since the fall of the Assad regime, in addition to the incursions inside Syria and occupying further land. After the occupied Golan Heights and the occupied buffer zone, Israel keeps occupying new villages every few weeks inside Syria. And this really jeopardizes the regional security. Regionalizing the Syrian conflict again is very dangerous at a point where the Middle East needs calm, needs de-escalation, and needs to give an opportunity for diplomacy and economic development to work on the poverty issues inside Syria. And finally, we've seen over and over again that what happens in Syria always spills over. Nothing stays in Syria. If Syria is destabilized further, this instability will cross the border and will destabilize the region. And the region really can't handle another conflict again. We need more diplomacy, we need talks, we need de-escalation, and we need to allow the Syrian state to rebuild its institution, to offer security and services to its own population.
Mm-hmm. So, Omar, Netanyahu, hundreds of airstrikes on Syria. Alsharaa zero airstrikes or retaliation against Israel. He's even stated that he's open to entertaining the Abraham Accords as well. Doesn't this seem like someone the Israeli administration would want to work with?
Yeah, actually, this was the hope. I mean, the United States of America has also encouraged Syria and Israel to speak with each other. And there were talks in Azerbaijan, and there were also mediation by the United Arab Emirates. And actually, things appear to move into the right direction. We have seen in Israeli media some reports about progress in the negotiations. But the issue here is that the Israeli side with these airstrikes basically torpedoed all of the progress that has been made in talks between Syria and Israel. And unfortunately, the Israeli position for a buffer zone in south of Syria, that the Syrian army should have no presence in south of Damascus, is something untenable. Because if there is no state authority, then we will see chaos and anarchy. As we are seeing now in Sweida, what's happening there is that the Bedouin and Arab tribes are now attacking the Druze militias, and there is no state authority to protect the civilians, and there are irregular forces fighting against each other. So there is no guarantee that similar things will not happen next to the Israeli occupied areas as well, and that there will be no Iranian infiltration to these areas to attack Israel. So this is actually not in the interest of Israel, but unfortunately, it appears that there's a miscalculation on the side of Israel. It appears that some within the government of Israel are preferring instability over stable neighborly relations with Syria.
Well, it definitely seems like Netanyahu's losing popularity. He just lost another member of Knesset. Now he's a minority government. Looks like possible elections on the horizon. William, will Netanyahu even hang around long enough to see the end of what he started in Iran, Gaza, or Syria?
Netanyahu is a survivor, and Netanyahu will do whatever it takes to remain in power for the reasons we've been analyzing, all of us, for 2 years now. That said, the Israeli people get a vote, and about 70% of Israelis are opposed to his current Gaza policy, the worst of it. And Israelis, I think, are torn on this this dual notion that the Israelis have, that one, as expressed by an Israeli minister shortly after October 7th, if you kill us, we'll take your territory. And of course, by extension, they're saying if you kill our allies, we'll take your territory. And the other one, that somehow if they can, expand Israel's borders and areas of control, that will create long-term stability. It won't. I don't believe it's a miscalculation, as the guest just before me said. I think it's a deliberate calculation that is going to backfire, and I do believe that the Israelis often trade some kind of short-termist approach to sort of grabbing and holding territory and ransoming that against peace, instead of actually doing the tough calculations about, what stabilizes and strengthens the countries around them. Israel doesn't want strong neighbors. It wants neighbors that bend to its will when it needs them to bend to its will, whether Lebanon, whether Syria, whether the Palestinians, whether. And I agree that this is a short-sighted strategy that will backfire. But I don't see any change in Israelis' thinking, in large part because of the domestic political considerations, and conflict helps Netanyahu, conflict in every direction. So, calming things down for stability's sake, to help Israel's long-term interests, I don't think is really on the cards.
Ibrahim, I have a two-pronged question for you. Earlier, William said if anyone's going to stop the Israelis, it's going to be the Americans. Do you see that type of desire, that type of will to stop a protracted operation into Syria? That's one. Number two, also the Turks. They're very invested in Syria. Do you see the Turks putting forth some type of initiative to stop the Israelis?
Those are great questions, and I think both trajectories or both paths we're going to see more developments on them. On the American side, there is certainly an interest in de-escalation, and the American policy has been clear from President Trump to Secretary of State Rubio to the envoy and the ambassador to Turkey, who's handling the Syrian file, Tom Barak. All of them, they do want to give Syria a chance. They do want to see Syria united. They do want to see Syria stable, and because they know that would allow the whole region to stabilize and work more towards economic development and stability. However, I don't know if the United States can actually pressure Israel. We've seen that failing in other places in the region, including Gaza. So I wonder if the United States will be able to shape the Israeli influence. They've tried, they've asked, but they haven't really pressured. And to your point on Turkey, Syria's stability is certainly in the national interest of Turkey, and Turkey has been very clear about that. It's actually one of the major regional players that shaped the American policy towards Syria in order to convince President Trump, in addition to Saudi Arabia, to give Syria a chance. And Turkey could put more diplomatic pressure and probably try to help, along with Azerbaijan, to open channels of communication between Damascus and Tel Aviv. But it's also here, it's a risky territory, because also that might actually draw Turkey into more intervention inside Syria at some point. The Israeli-Turkish tension in Syria should be managed, because these are two powerful countries, and they both have interest in Syria. And if this relationship goes wrong, this would really jeopardize the whole regional security, and that should not happen.
So, Omar, you heard Ibrahim's answer. He's saying that Turkey and Israel need to be careful, that two powerful countries in the region and both very invested in Syria or have interests in Syria. Now, up till now, Erdogan's been keeping it rhetorically his opposition to what Netanyahu is doing. Where's the red line where he says enough is enough?
I mean, we have to clearly assess that Turkey and Israel are on opposing ends in terms of the strategy towards Syria. And Turkey has been the major supporter of the new Syrian government. And Turkey has managed, actually, together with Saudi Arabia, to convince the Trump administration to engage with the Syrian government. And it appears that there is a mutual understanding between the United States of America and Turkey in regards to coordination and cooperation in Syria. That being said, Turkey has still some cards to play that Turkey has not in terms of Israel, and Turkey is trying to find a mediated solution. Turkey is trying to establish a deconfliction mechanism with Israel to avoid a misunderstanding and to avoid direct escalation. And the United States of America need here to mediate between Turkey and Israel, because there are plans for the establishment of a Turkish military base in Syria, which would ultimately limit Israeli freedom to bomb whenever, wherever, and however they want in Syrian territory. And there is also the issue that Turkey is a counterbalance against Israel in terms of Syria diplomatically. We have seen that all the Arab states and Turkey condemned Israel in a joint statement. So there is an emerging Turkish-Arab coordination and alliance in regards towards Syria, and this axis between the Turks and the Arabs to protect Syria is something that counterbalances Israel regionally, and that Israel has to consider. So I don't think that we are in a pathway towards direct escalation between Turkey and Israel, but there are definitely tensions that could spiral out of control. And for that not to happen, we need American mediation.
Mm-hmm. William, there was sanctions that were lifted by the United States and the EU very recently, sanctions imposed on Syria. Now we also saw global condemnation, or at least Western condemnation. So does this mean that the West wants a West-friendly Syria, or they want to play an important role in the rebuilding and rehabilitation of the country? Do they want to kind of bring it into the Western fold, away from Russia, away from Iran?
100%. And I think the U.S. and Europe see Turkey as a linchpin here. I agree a lot with what the previous guest said about the role of Turkey, the importance of Turkey. I mean, a Turkish-Israeli entente is a sine qua non for success in Syria in the ways that my co-panelists described. And there's no question that the Russians being marginalized and the Iranians being marginalized in Syria is seen as a huge win by the West and by Israel. And that's one of the reasons why there are some gestures, some lip service, some statements, and some efforts by the United States to restrain Israel's worst instincts here. But what often happens in these situations is that, the very thing that you're doing to try to improve your security situation makes your security situation worse. And that's the risk in everything that Israel's doing. I think there's also a larger, longer term risk here, not only of the sort of strength of the Syrian state and of the ability of Syria to turn the political and economic corner towards success, but of a greater devolution, and all of those of us that follow Libya very closely are watching Syria and thinking, Libya had it even easier in certain respects and ended up 2 years out into a civil war, and there are at least 5 or 6 fault lines around Syria that could lead later towards regional or larger civil conflicts, not of the same variety of Libya, and of course many of the aspects are different here. But what weakens Syria over here can then help weaken Syria over there. And you could see a kind of devolution, a kind of a backsliding of Syria in a security and political sense if this isn't gotten under control very quickly. It's sort of like a demonstration effect. And the meddling of outside powers is a problem here. You can't have Russia gone, but then Israel not taking a Russia-sized role, but Israel intervening in a way that then creates big headaches, not just for the Shara government, but for the Turks. And so this is a critical moment right now where, either the international community in cooperation with Damascus can tamp this down and put things on the right path, or we could have this continuing unraveling that could then create demonstration effects for those that don't support what's going on in Damascus and want themselves power, and then you can have, attempts of coups within coups or civil conflicts or other agreements around Syria unraveling. So those are some of the fears that I have.
Mm-hmm. Ibrahim, I want to ask you about the YPG, a Kurdish group that Turkey has designated as a terrorist group in the northeast of the country predominantly. Now, when they're looking at what's happening right now, and at the beginning, after the revolution, it looked like they were ready to fall in line with Alshara's government. They had made overtures. But it seems like lately they're viewing this chaos as an opportunity. What are they interested in?
The negotiations between the Syrian Democratic Forces and the YPG and the authority in Damascus, generally speaking, have been on positive trajectories. Of course, there have been ups and downs, but generally speaking, there were more convergence than divergence since the collapse of the Assad regime. However, as you've mentioned, very recently and lately, we've seen more signals that these negotiations and this path for reconciliation and reintegration is becoming more unlikely, and more difficulties and challenges are emerging. And I do think what happened in Sweida will make this process even slower, or probably more difficult, for 2 reasons. One of them, probably now the Kurds, the YPG, the Syrian Democratic Forces, will feel more emboldened that Israel might come to their aid if there are confrontations, even though it's important to highlight that the Druze are in southern Syria while the Kurds are in northern Syria. And then the other factor is the mistrust So after also what they've seen happening in Sweida, there might, or the mistrust might have widened between the Kurds and Damascus, which makes that a national dialogue and more channels of communication more important than before, because now the chances of a relapse and to fall into chaos and infighting again has increased recently, and that won't serve anyone. It won't serve the Kurds, it won't serve Damascus and the Arabs, and it won't ultimately serve the Druze as well. There is only one path for Syrians, either to reintegrate and rebuild state institutions and redevelop a new social contract, or it will be a collapse and fragmentation.
Ibrahim, Ömer, William, thanks for helping me break down a very complex issue. And that's all for this edition of Straight Talk with me, Yusuf Aram. If you got any comments, please share them with us on X at Straight Talk TRT. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can find more exclusive content. Until next time, take care and goodbye.